Hey guys, it's Bear here with Journey to Preparedness, helping you prepare not for your doomsday, but your everyday. So this is video version of podcast number 39, and we talked about the many methods of gardening. And on this podcast, we went through everything from traditional in-ground gardening to container gardening to the wicking buckets to everything. So I'll kind of give you a general overview of some of the things. I discussed some of the pros and cons to these different methods, and I'll give you those now here. So let's start with your traditional in-ground garden that all of our, grandparents, great-grandparents, parents, whatever had. And this is your traditional style rows. You till up the ground, you set your rows up and plant exactly how everything tells you, spacing, 6 inches, 18 inches, so on. Each row is set up nice and neat. Some of the benefits to that type of gardening is it's tested, right? Tried and true. It's been working for years and years and years. Again, our grandparents did it, great-grandparents, they all did that version of gardening. So it's something that is well known and it's known to work. Some of the cons to it are it takes a lot of space to grow a little bit of plants. Weeding can be an issue. It's going to take a lot of time, weeding in between the rows. When we first set up our first garden bed, I did a 8x8 garden bed, kind of raised bed-ish. They were like 8-inch, 8x8, 8-inch landscape timbers that we had set up, and then I brought in some compost and things like that and filled it in, so it was above ground, but it was huge, 8 foot by 8 foot. And then from there we expanded the next year. I think we went like 16 by 16 and whatever it was, 12 by 12, and then we ended up going like 20 by 20. I mean, we just expanded it so it was like a raised bed in-ground garden. And when we set this up, we did your traditional rows, and it worked great. For many years, the problem we had was the weeding. Constantly having to get in there and weed that garden, and it took a lot of time. And then we switched over. I shouldn't say we switched over, but we started to incorporate other methods of gardening, and we started doing your more traditional raised bed gardens, which are, you can go 4x4 or 4x8, and the reason you go with those 4 feet by 4 feet or 4 feet by 8 feet is the 4 feet wide is that way you can reach from each side of the garden bed. So you can reach the center without having to go into the garden bed. And then you don't have to till. You're not compacting that soil. You're keeping it nice and loose. If you bring in the proper compost and materials, you're keeping that nice and loose, and you don't ever have to till. So you're saving that tilling. It also makes it, by bringing in that soil, that compost, that fresh organic matter, you're not going to get that weed, all those weeds in there that you could be drumming up by tilling every year. See, in your soil there are a lot of dormant seeds, and every time you stir up that soil, there's that potential that those seeds could come out of dormancy and start to germinate, and then now you're running that risk of that weed growing. By having this 4x8 fresh new bed, you're reducing that weed pressure, and you're not tilling it, you're not moving that soil a ton, so there's not that chance. They're still going to get weeds in there, but it's a lot less. And it also makes weeding a lot easier because you've got smaller space that you need to take care of. And even if you're going bed by bed, it doesn't take long, even if you have more than one bed. And we started out with a couple, and in fact now this year we've changed. If you look back at one of the old videos of the garden bed that I did, with that big garden bed area we actually just redid that this year when we put in new raised beds there, so we changed that over. So raised beds is another one, and with raised beds you can get into the square foot gardening method. And what that is you take that 4x8 bed or 4x4 and you break it down into 1 foot sections. And then there's actually, I'll leave a link below to Mel Bartholomew's Square Foot Gardening book. But that breaks down exactly the soil mixture to use for that. And I'm going to be honest, the full disclosure, I've never used that soil mixture, but he actually gives you a soil mixture for square foot gardening, and then he also gives you the density in which you can plant. And that's one of the nice things with these raised beds, is because you are putting in your own soil mixture and organic matter. You can get well draining soil, and it's not compact, and you can actually they found that through the years, you can actually plant more densely than what the row gardens have set forth. And by doing that, you can also reduce the risk of weeds, because there's not that open soil, because there's a canopy over it, because it's densely planted and densely managed, and therefore there's no, it doesn't appear as though there's bare soil, right? Bare soil was not intended on this planet. That's why everything has grass, right? And not even grass, but just even in fields, in nature, you've got flowers and weeds and herbs and everything that grows in there, because the soil was not intended to be bare. So if there's bare soil, something's going to look to come in there and cover that soil, and it's going to be something you probably don't want. So by putting in these square foot garden beds, right, by doing the square foot gardening, you're increasing the planting and densely planting, and then you are covering that soil. Okay, so square foot gardening is part of a method within the raised bed gardening. It's great. I do somewhat of a version of it, because I don't have that exact soil mix, so I don't do that, but I do use some of the square foot measurements for density of planting, but I probably go a little bit less. I don't plant quite as dense, but still a lot denser than your traditional garden. Container gardening is another one, especially if you're in small spaces. They work great. One of the downfalls, same with the raised bed gardening, is the fact that they can dry out. Now your raised bed not nearly as quickly, but your container gardens, you can plant right in any size pot, basically. As long as you got a pot that is going to be a decent size for whatever you're planting, it's going to work. Just the watering is going to be becoming an issue. Keeping that ground moist, not letting that plant dry out and die, is where the issue is going to come, and that's one of the negativities of it. The positives of it is that it can be moved. It's mobile, right? You can move it to different locations. You can set up nice planters outside of your house to add to your landscape. It doesn't look, you can dress it up so it doesn't look like a garden. It looks like a planter that anybody else would have. It just happens to be that you have something edible in there instead of just decorative flowers. Like I said, it can be moved anywhere, but you could run into some watering issues. So if you're not going to be around, you're going to be taken off, that could be you could risk losing that plant if you don't have an irrigation system on a timer, or you're not regularly maintaining it. One of the nice alternatives, which I covered, and I'll leave a link to the video up here, right? Yeah, up here. One of these two sides, I don't remember. I'll leave a link to it, and it is the wicking buckets that I put together. And with these wicking buckets, what is nice about them is there's a reservoir down on the bottom, and that fills with water. And then you've got your soil above that, and that water wicks up into that soil, so it's keeping that moisture. So it reduces the amount of time that you have to actually water your plants. All right, it reduces the evaporation of the water because it's underneath and it's wicking up, so you're not getting as much evaporation, but you're also it's containing that water, so you don't have to go out there and water every day. Once a week, maybe every 3 to 4 days, depending on your climate, depending on the rainfall. Right, last year where we had so much rain, it was crazy. I actually never had to go out and fill that thing once. It pretty much always had water in it, and it always kept it the soil moist. The roots were getting everything it needed. So for me, it was pretty much hands off last year, which was awesome. and it did by far better than any container I've ever had, just any standard containers. So I would highly recommend using those. They're still going to be mobile, which is awesome. Reduced watering. I really don't know that I have a bad thing to say about them, other than you're not going to be able to, if you're relying solely on those as your method, you're going to need a lot of them depending on what you're trying to plant. You're going to get one pepper plant in per container. You're going to get one tomato plant per container. You might be able to get a couple cucumber plants, but you're going to have multiples. It goes with the same with a traditional container, any sort of container gardening. You're going to have multiple containers that you're going to need to set up if you're going to do multiple crops. Whereas we're a 4x8 bed or a 4x4 bed, or your traditional in-ground garden beds, you can do a lot more crops in there depending on the size of the garden you're going to set up. But those are just 4 of them that I'm going to cover here on this video. If you want to get the rest and you want to get more in depth, go check out the podcast, journeytopreparedness.net, or you can or the podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, wherever podcasts are available. All right. Thanks for watching. Till next time, this has been Bear, Journey to Preparedness, helping you prepare not for your doomsday, but your everyday. Peace.